At an altitude of 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands in August 1943, Lieutenant Richard Bong witnessed his wingman's P-38 Lightning plummet uncontrollably into the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. 3 Japanese Zeros had ambushed them from above, leaving Bong isolated with the lead Zero menacingly pursuing his tail. He initiated the standard defensive maneuver, a sharp right bank executed with full throttle, endeavoring to ascend beyond the immediate threat. However, the nimble Zero tightened its turn with alarming efficiency. The Japanese pilot was already positioning for an attack, and Bong had perhaps 4 precarious seconds before 20mm cannon fire shredded his aircraft. What transpired next deviated entirely from any established flight instruction. Bong decisively rolled his P-38 completely inverted and thrust the control column ahead. Instead of striving to climb away from the imminent danger, his aircraft plunged steeply toward the ocean. Yet, by virtue of being upside down, he diverged along a trajectory the Zero pilot had never anticipated. Blood surged into his cranium. His peripheral vision crimsoned at the edges. For 2 critical seconds, he struggled to discern his instruments. When he rolled level again at 12,000 feet, the Zero was above him, having passed beyond its target, entirely out of position. Bong had survived, and he had just inadvertently discovered a strategy that would fundamentally alter air combat across the Pacific theater. This maneuver flagrantly contravened every precept taught at flight school. Instructors at training bases situated in California and Arizona had explicitly cautioned pilots about the perils of negative G flight, potential propulsion system malfunction, compromise to airframe integrity, and temporary disablement of the aviator. The formal stance was unequivocal. Nevertheless, in the crucible of actual combat, when a Zero pilot had achieved a lethal alignment, those warnings held secondary importance to instantaneous preservation. The aviators who lived through their initial encounters with Zeros absorbed a brutal truth. Orthodox aerial combat methodology was proving lethal to American pilots. Japanese aviators had meticulously honed their combat methodologies through years of operational experience over China. They comprehended each inherent superiority their Mitsubishi A6M0 commanded. American pilots were perishing because they engaged in accordance with pre-war instruction against an adversary who had already abandoned those tactical precepts. The narrative of inverted flight tactics signifies more than standard military history. Between 1942 and 1944, a relatively select cadre of fighter pilots discovered that the human body could endure physiological strains aviation medicine had deemed unfeasible. They learned their aircraft could tolerate aerial movements engineers maintained would lead to airframe collapse. Most crucially, they proved that sometimes survival necessitated navigating headlong into peril rather than retreating from it. This was not the expurgated account of Pacific air combat that featured in official after-action reports. This was fierce, unsparing ingenuity forged by relentless imperative, where fraction-of-a-second judgments distinguished aviators who returned to their aerodrome from those whose names were inscribed on rolls of the fallen. The Mitsubishi A6M0 commenced operational service over China in 1940. And by the time America entered the war in December 1941, Japanese pilots had amassed thousands of flight hours and engagements, meticulously refining their operational strategies. The Zero's operational attributes presented a lethal dilemma for Allied aviators. At speeds below 300 miles per hour, the Zero could outmaneuver almost all opposing aircraft in the sky. Its arc of maneuverability at combat speeds was approximately 400 feet narrower than a P-38 Lightning and nearly 500 feet tighter than an F-4F Wildcat. In a conventional circling aerial engagement, the kind greatly stressed within American instructional curricula, the Zero pilot could simply execute a tighter arc within his adversary's trajectory and establish an optimal gunnery position within mere seconds. Initial engagement reports from the Philippines and Java conveyed a somber narrative. American pilots endeavored to employ high-speed attack and disengage maneuvers, plunging upon Zeros from a superior height, firing, then climbing away. However, if the initial assault did not neutralize the adversary, the Zero pilot would simply initiate a sharply banked level maneuver. When the American pilot tried to follow, he discovered he was on the wider arc of the engagement, dissipating airspeed, transitioning from pursuer to quarry. By mid-1942, engagement statistics in some sectors skewed 3-1 in favor of Japanese pilots. Squadron commanders were submitting dispatches that fundamentally conceded the same stark reality. We cannot win turning fights against this aircraft. The F-4F Wildcat, operated by Navy and Marine aviators, possessed greater velocity in a descent and could withstand more combat-induced harm, but its aileron response was sluggish. The P-40 Warhawk performed admirably in ascents and descents, but struggled in elevated atmospheric conditions where many engagements occurred. The P-38 Lightning featured twin engines and substantial armament, yet its broad arc of maneuverability rendered it susceptible in level plane engagements. Each American fighter type boasted distinct advantages: firepower, defensive plating, dive speed, but none could collectively match the Zero's nimbleness in traditional maneuvering combat. Pilots were instructed to leverage their plane's inherent capabilities, steer clear of circling aerial contests, and preserve a superior speed and altitude. This was prudent counsel, but combat seldom transpired as anticipated. What exacerbated this strategic predicament was the exceptional proficiency of Japanese naval aviators in 1942 and early 1943. Many had been executing operational sorties since the late 1930s. They comprehended the dynamics of speed and altitude, anticipatory gunnery, and coordinated aerial maneuvers at a masterful degree. They knew precisely how to compel U.S. aviators into predicaments where the Zero's maneuvering prowess proved conclusive. A frequent enemy strategy involved one Zero serving as a lure, flying straight and level, appearing exposed. When an American pilot initiated the engagement, two more Zeros would descend from a higher position or approach from the flanks. The American fighter was abruptly on the back foot, and being defensive meant entering a turning fight, which inevitably meant the Zero's advantages became insurmountable. The principles of aerial maneuvering are relentless. Turn radius is contingent upon velocity and gravitational force applied. The Zero's minimalist airframe design, attained in part through the omission of armor protection and puncture-resistant fuel bladders, endowed it with exceptional maneuvering capability. American fighters, conversely, were equipped with protective sheeting behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing tanks, and more substantial weaponry. These features enhanced aviator survival upon impact, but they also added hundreds of pounds that elevated stress on the wings and expanded the arc of a turn. American pilots were fundamentally tasked with overcoming an opponent who possessed the paramount superiority in dogfighting while flying aircraft designed primarily for endurance over agility. The maneuver that would eventually preserve countless American lives did not originate from aviation design manuals or strategic principles. It arose from sheer exigency and fortuitous revelation. The split S, as it came to be designated, entailed inverting the aircraft and executing a downward curve. In standard aerial operation, pilots undergo positive G-forces. Circulatory fluid is driven downwards toward their feet. Peripheral sight diminishes, and at around 5 to 6 gs, many pilots experience visual dimming or complete loss of sight. However, When a pilot flips the aircraft over and moves the control column ahead, he encounters negative GS. Circulatory fluid surges into the cranium. The effect is termed red out, because the scope of vision genuinely reddens as ocular capillaries swell. Aviation medicine in 1942 posited that individuals had minimal endurance for negative G forces. Research demonstrated that even negative 2 GS induced severe discomfort, loss of bearing, and a risk of ocular injury. Formal directives advised against shunning negative G flight entirely, but these studies were performed in regulated settings with experimental aviators not under enemy fire. Wartime conditions presented an alternative equation. A pilot undergoing a brief period of crimson sight but evading a Zero's firing alignment survived. An aviator who adhered to ideal upward gravitational flight but remained within the enemy's targeting reticle died. The decision was not between ease and hardship. It was momentary. Visual impairment against everlasting demise. The aerodynamic principles underpinning the inverted maneuver's efficacy encompass kinetic control and adversary anticipation. When a Zero pilot gained a pursuing advantage, he expected the quarry would either endeavor to outmaneuver him in a turn, an unfeasible feat, or attempt to ascend, thereby dissipating the U.S. plane's kinetic potential and rendering it a more vulnerable prey. The inverted dive did neither. It transformed height into velocity along a trajectory the enemy aviator had not foreseen. More importantly, if the Japanese pilot endeavored to replicate the aerial evolution, his aircraft encountered airframe constraints. The Zero was designed to withstand positive G loads up to about 7 GS, but its more delicate airframe rendered downward gravitational maneuvers exceptionally perilous. Pulling negative GS in a Zero jeopardized airframe integrity or propulsion system malfunctions, because the aircraft systems were not engineered for prolonged upside-down operation. The P-38's twin Allison engines offered an additional benefit during downward gravitational maneuvers. Unlike aircraft powered by a solitary engine utilizing carburetor systems, which could suffer from a lack of fuel supply during upside-down aerial movements, the P-38's engines employed alternative fuel delivery mechanisms that operated with greater consistency under negative G stresses. This did not represent an intentional engineering characteristic. The aircraft designers at Lockheed had not envisioned inverted aerial engagement strategies, but it became strategically crucial. A P-38 pilot could sustain propulsion during a downward inverted plunge, while some enemy planes in pursuit could undergo a temporary reduction in thrust, consequently increasing the distance between aircraft, thereby further widening the tactical separation. Medical understanding at the time generally underestimated the human body's capacity to withstand negative G forces, especially during brief, intense exposures. Pilots who executed a proper split-S maneuver consistently reported that the disorienting redout effect, characterized by a crimsoning of the entire visual field, typically subsided within a mere few seconds. Vision would reliably return as the aircraft transitioned from negative to positive G flight during the subsequent pull-out phase. Although the physical repercussions were undoubtedly severe, manifesting as throbbing headaches, profound facial fatigue, and visibly bloodshot eyes, they were ultimately deemed survivable. In their post-mission debriefings, numerous airmen articulated a stark preference. Enduring a crippling headache upon returning to base was infinitely more desirable than facing a solemn burial at sea. Their informal, yet acutely practical, risk assessment was unequivocally straightforward. While negative G maneuvers inflicted considerable pain, the impact of Japanese cannon fire inflicted a far greater, and often terminal, consequence. Major Thomas Lynch, a distinguished pilot within the 39th Fighter Squadron, operating his P-38 Lightning aircraft from the strategic hub of Port Moresby, New Guinea, stands as the inaugural aviator whose actions unequivocally documented the deliberate, rather than merely instinctive, application of the inverted dive tactic. On the 11th day of April in 1943, Major Lynch was at the helm of a four-plane patrol soaring above the expansive Huon Gulf when his formation unexpectedly encountered a superior force of 80 fighters at an altitude of 20,000 feet. Eschewing the conventional approach of engaging in a protracted horizontal dogfight, Lynch executed an immediate inverted roll as the leading Zero closed in on his position. He then masterfully pulled through into a precipitously steep dive, rapidly accelerating his P-38 to speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, before expertly leveling out at 8,000 feet. The Zero pilot, who had attempted to maintain pursuit, was compelled to break off his dive at 12,000 feet, evidently either disinclined or physically incapable of matching Lynch's audacious dive angle and formidable speed. Lynch's audacious maneuver transcended mere survival. It fundamentally inverted the tactical dynamic of the engagement. Having successfully leveled out, he now possessed the critical advantages of both significant altitude separation and markedly superior speed. He skillfully leveraged this newfound energy advantage to initiate a climb, re-engaging the now fragmented and disoriented Japanese formation from a position of tactical superiority, approaching them from below. The Zero pilots, having lost their original cohesive structure, were scattered, actively pursuing what they mistakenly perceived to be retreating American fighters. In the ensuing, decisive engagement, Major Lynch personally accounted for the destruction of 2 Zeros. Furthermore, his wingmen, having emulated his innovative inverted dive maneuver, emerged from the encounter entirely unscathed. While the official after-action report dutifully documented the novel tactic, it conspicuously refrained from emphasizing its revolutionary implications. Indeed, established military doctrine at the time continued to actively discourage the use of negative G maneuvers due to perceived physiological risks. The profound significance of Major Lynch's actions resided primarily in their deliberate intentionality. Prior to this, other pilots might have instinctively rolled inverted under extreme duress, survived the ordeal, and subsequently attributed their escape to sheer fortune. Lynch, however, possessed the strategic foresight to recognize this maneuver not as a fortunate happenstance, but as a repeatable, systematic technique. With remarkable alacrity, within a mere week of his groundbreaking engagement, he began imparting the intricacies of the maneuver to his fellow pilots within the squadron during informal, ad hoc briefings. The instructional guidance he provided was strikingly simple and direct. If a Zero gets on your tail in a position where you can't shake him conventionally, roll inverted, pull through, dive hard, and use the speed to separate. He adamantly advised against attempting to outturn the nimble Zero horizontally, instead urging his pilots to exploit the vertical dimension of combat. His dictum was clear. The Zero undeniably reigned supreme in the horizontal turning circle, but American fighters, with their robust engines and structural integrity, held an undeniable dominion in the vertical dive. By the advent of June 1943, this innovative tactic had progressively diffused throughout other P-38 units stationed in the vital operational areas of Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. Airmen enthusiastically exchanged details of the technique during casual ready-room discussions and within the more structured environment of inter-squadron debriefings. Despite its growing prevalence, the maneuver steadfastly maintained its unofficial status. It was never explicitly prohibited, yet it conspicuously lacked formal endorsement within official tactical directives. While squadron leaders readily acknowledged its palpable effectiveness in combat, they exhibited a marked reluctance to commit its instruction to written policy. This hesitation stemmed, in part, from significant liability concerns. Should a pilot unfortunately perish while attempting a maneuver that contravened established training protocols, uncomfortable inquiries would undoubtedly arise regarding the authorization of such an unorthodox tactic. Consequently, the knowledge propagated primarily through an informal oral tradition, with seasoned pilots discreetly demonstrating its execution to newer arrivals, meticulously avoiding any form of written documentation. The 475th Fighter Group, upon its arrival in the Southwest Pacific Theater in August 1943, was quickly brought up to speed on the inverted dive tactic through informal briefings conducted by battle-hardened veterans of the 49th Fighter Group. Major Charles McDonald, who would ultimately distinguish himself as one of the Pacific Theater's preeminent aces with an astonishing 27 confirmed kills, later unequivocally credited the Split S maneuver with preserving his life on no fewer than 3 separate occasions during intense aerial combat. His meticulously compiled combat reports from the latter half of 1943 clearly delineate a consistent tactical pattern, initiating engagements with Zeros from a position of superior altitude, executing a high-speed pass, and then, if subjected to a counterattack during the subsequent climb, immediately rolling inverted and diving away to disengage. The overarching objective was to effectively reset the engagement on terms that were unequivocally favorable to the American fighter. This was not a display of elegant, nuanced dogfighting. Rather, it represented a pragmatic, industrial-strength application of survival mathematics that, incidentally, often culminated in decisive victory. The physiological toll exacted by negative G flight represented a formidable challenge for which no existing training manual had adequately prepared the pilots. During the execution of a typical Split S maneuver, which involved sustaining negative forces ranging from -2 to -3 gs, the blood pressure within the pilot's head surged dramatically. Pilots universally reported an instantaneous sensation of intense, almost crushing, pressure directly behind their eyes, swiftly followed by the distinctive redout effect, wherein their entire field of vision became suffused with a vivid crimson hue. This profound pressure originated from the engorgement of the delicate blood vessels within the retina and conjunctiva, as blood was forcefully displaced upwards by the powerful negative acceleration. For the critical duration of these 2 to 3 seconds, the pilot was, to all practical intents and purposes, flying completely blind, compelled to rely solely on their kinesthetic sense and an ingrained memory of their instrument panel to maintain precise control of the aircraft. Flight Surgeon Captain James Moorhead, strategically stationed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal during the latter part of 1943, meticulously documented the physical aftermath observed in pilots who frequently employed these inverted dive tactics. His comprehensive examinations of dozens of these airmen revealed that nearly all exhibited petechial hemorrhaging, tiny, discernible broken blood vessels that manifested as distinct red spots across their faces, most notably around the delicate orbital regions and the forehead. A subset of pilots experienced more severe subconjunctival hemorrhages, which resulted in their eyes remaining conspicuously blood red for several days following the maneuver. Severe, persistent headaches were a universal complaint among all who performed the tactic. Furthermore, a smaller number of pilots reported temporary visual impairments, including blurred sight or persistent difficulty in focusing, symptoms that often lingered for several hours after landing. Captain Moorhead's unofficial medical conclusion, though never formally published in any medical journal, posited that while these maneuvers undeniably inflicted measurable physical damage, they did not, in his professional opinion, result in anything permanently debilitating to the aviators. The paramount risk inherent in the inverted dive maneuver was unquestionably the fleeting but absolute moment of blindness itself. During those critical few seconds of redout, a pilot was utterly deprived of the ability to perceive vital flight information from his altimeter, airspeed indicator, or attitude instruments. Moreover, he was completely unable to visually track the enemy aircraft, nor could he discern the ground rapidly approaching below. The successful execution of this maneuver demanded an absolute and unwavering commitment. A pilot was required to precisely establish the dive angle, initiate the negative G-forces, and then steadfastly maintain that specific control input until his vision gradually cleared, placing implicit trust in his prior judgment of altitude before commencing the inverted roll. Several tragic fatal accidents occurred during training exercises when pilots either initiated the maneuver at a dangerously low altitude or sustained the dive for an excessively prolonged duration. At a mere 5,000 feet, there existed virtually no margin for error. Conversely, at an altitude of 15,000 feet, a pilot typically possessed sufficient time to correct any minor misjudgment. Consequently, a crucial mathematical calculation became an intrinsic component of survival strategy. Under no circumstances should a pilot go inverted below 8,000 feet, unless the alternative was the absolute certainty of death. Seasoned pilots, through repeated combat experience, progressively refined and developed specific techniques aimed at minimizing the duration of the debilitating redout. Some discovered that by consciously tensing their neck and facial muscles, they could exert a degree of constriction on blood flow to the head, thereby mitigating the intensity of the upward blood surge. Others ascertained that if they executed the inverted roll with a less aggressive pull on the control stick, they could achieve a compromise, trading a fraction of the maneuver's maximum performance for the critical advantage of slightly improved, partial vision throughout the maneuver. This delicate balance invariably became a critical judgment call in the heat of combat. Maximum negative G input undeniably generated the most rapid and decisive separation from a pursuing zero, but it invariably resulted in a complete visual blackout. Conversely, a more moderate negative G input allowed the pilot to retain some degree of visual reference, though it inherently diminished the overall effectiveness and speed of the escape. In the practical realities of aerial combat, the overwhelming majority of pilots ultimately opted for maximum separation, understanding that it was far preferable to endure 3 seconds of complete blindness and emerge alive than to be semi-aware and shot down. The psychological dimension of the inverted dive maneuver presented an equally formidable challenge. Human beings are endowed with powerful evolutionary instincts that actively recoil from actions inducing pain and sensory deprivation. The deliberate act of voluntarily inducing temporary blindness, while simultaneously being targeted by an adversary, is fundamentally antithetical to every ingrained survival instinct. Yet, combat pilots, through sheer force of will and repeated exposure, learn to override this profound instinct. The initial experience of performing the maneuver was universally terrifying. The second time, while perhaps marginally less shocking, remained profoundly frightening. However, by the 5th or 6th repetition, it gradually transformed into just another unpleasant, albeit necessary, aspect of combat flying, akin to enduring anti-aircraft flak, meticulously managing dwindling fuel reserves, or witnessing the tragic loss of comrades. The human body adapted, and, crucially, the mind adapted. What seemed utterly impossible within a controlled training environment became a routine, albeit unwelcome, necessity when the terrifying alternative was a devastating 20mm cannon shell tearing through the cockpit. The inverted dive tactic permeated the vast expanse of the Pacific theater like a clandestine transmission, stealthily propagating from one squadron to another without ever once appearing in any official tactical publication. By September 1943, P-38 units stationed across the strategic territories of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were routinely incorporating the maneuver into the informal training regimen for replacement pilots during their very first week in country. The instruction was characteristically informal, often taking place after the evening mess, when veteran pilots would take new arrivals aside, imparting invaluable practical wisdom regarding what techniques proved effective and what actions led to fatal consequences. Squadron commanders were unequivocally aware of its widespread practice. Some actively and openly encouraged its adoption. Others, however, adopted a stance of deliberate ignorance, thereby maintaining a crucial degree of plausible deniability should 5th Air Force Headquarters ever pose uncomfortable questions regarding unauthorized training protocols. Colonel Neil Kirby, the commanding officer of the 348th Fighter Group, operating P-47 Thunderbolts from the base at Port Moresby, took the decisive step of formally incorporating the Split S into his unit's tactical doctrine in October 1943. The P-47, being significantly heavier than the P-38, was inherently and hopelessly outmatched in any sustained turning combat against the agile Zeros. However, the Thunderbolt possessed an unparalleled diving capability, exceeding almost any other aircraft in the sky, and its robust radial engine demonstrated a commendable tolerance for negative G flight. Colonel Kirby's tactical approach was characterized by its unwavering pragmatism. He unequivocally informed his pilots that any attempt to engage a Zero in a turning fight would invariably result in their demise. Conversely, he asserted that by strategically leveraging the P-47's considerable weight and formidable power to dictate vertical engagements, employing aggressive diving attacks followed by inverted escapes when necessary, they would not only survive, but also achieve victory. Colonel Kirby personally exemplified these tactics, shooting down 6 Japanese aircraft on October 11, 1943, during a single, decisive mission. His extraordinary courage and tactical acumen on that mission were recognized with the awarding of the Medal of Honor. Marine Corps F-4U Corsair squadrons, adopting analogous methodologies in early 1944, quickly leveraged the inverted dive. The Corsair, a formidable fighter, exhibited superior performance characteristics over the Japanese Zero in most operational parameters, with the notable exception of its turning radius. Marine aviators, operating from austere island outposts such as Munda and Vella La Vella, discovered that this daring inverted maneuver proved even more efficacious in the robust Corsair than it had in the earlier twin-engine fighters. The F-4U's potent Pratt and Whitney R2800 engine was engineered to sustain unwavering thrust even through demanding negative G maneuvers, while the aircraft's inherently strong structural integrity empowered pilots to recover from high-speed dives without any apprehension regarding potential wing failure. Major Robert Gaylor, a key figure in imparting tactical wisdom to VMF 214, famously known as the Black Sheep Squadron, consistently demonstrated the maneuver, underscoring its pivotal role as a defensive escape strategy rather than an offensive weapon. By the middle of 1944, this innovative technique had permeated Navy carrier squadrons actively engaged in the Central Pacific Theater. Fighter pilots, launching from the decks of illustrious carriers like the USS Essex and USS Lexington, began receiving comprehensive briefings that now formally incorporated inverted maneuvers as an accepted and vital component of their tactical repertoire. The specific nomenclature employed for this maneuver exhibited some variation. Some airmen referred to it as a split S, others designated it a negative G brake, while a segment simply described the action as rolling out downward. Ultimately, the precise terminology was inconsequential. The execution remained steadfastly consistent. When conventional defensive stratagems proved inadequate, the prescribed response was to invert the aircraft and initiate a steep dive. A critical safety threshold persisted at approximately 8,000 feet. Below this crucial altitude, pilots were explicitly instructed to pursue alternative escape avenues or, grimly, to accept that they were embroiled in a fight to the death. It was also understood that not every type of aircraft possessed the inherent design capabilities to safely execute this particular maneuver. Navy A-6F Hellcat pilots, for instance, frequently reported that their carbureted engines sometimes sputtered or completely ceased operation during prolonged inverted flight, although they typically reignited with commendable rapidity. Conversely, Army Air Force's P-40 pilots found that while their aircraft possessed the requisite structural integrity to perform the maneuver, they unfortunately lacked the necessary dive performance to generate sufficient separation from pursuing Zero fighters. These intrinsic limitations unequivocally dictated that tactical approaches remained highly aircraft-specific. Consequently, a P-38 pilot could confidently rely upon the inverted dive as a primary defensive instrument, whereas a P-40 pilot was compelled to explore and utilize entirely different escape options to ensure survival. The fundamental principle underpinning these tactics, however, had by this point achieved universal acceptance across the entire theater of operations. Vertical maneuvers, which included inverted flight when the situation demanded, consistently proved superior to horizontal turning engagements. Japanese pilots eventually recognized the distinctive American inverted dive tactic and subsequently commenced efforts to devise effective countermeasures. By the concluding months of 1943, combat reports originating from returning Zero pilots began to feature recurring mentions of American fighters rolling inverted and rapidly diving away at high velocities. Initial Japanese assessments erroneously interpreted this as an exclusively defensive maneuver, perceiving it as tangible evidence that American pilots harbored a fear of close combat and were actively fleeing rather than courageously engaging. This particular interpretation proved strategically perilous for Japanese airmen because it inadvertently reinforced their pre-existing, often flawed, tactical doctrine while simultaneously obscuring the genuine threat posed by the American innovation. The inverted dive was unequivocally not a retreat. Instead, it served as a tactical reset that afforded American pilots the crucial advantage of choosing precisely when and how to re-engage on terms highly favorable to them. Some Japanese pilots, in a desperate attempt to counter this new threat, endeavored to follow American fighters through their inverted dives. The outcomes of these attempts were, more often than not, catastrophic and frequently fatal. The Zero's lightweight construction, a characteristic that bestowed upon it its renowned superior turning performance, paradoxically transformed into a significant liability during high-speed vertical maneuvers. The aircraft's airframe was primarily stressed for positive G limits, but possessed significantly reduced safety margins when subjected to negative G flight. Several Zero pilots, who audaciously attempted to pursue P-38s through aggressive inverted dives, subsequently experienced severe control surface flutter, or, tragically, outright structural failure. Others discovered that their Nakajima Sakai engines suffered from critical fuel delivery problems during inverted flight, resulting in a debilitating loss of power at the most inopportune moment, mid-dive, precisely when they were striving to maintain visual contact with an elusive enemy aircraft. A meticulously documented incident from December 1944, occurring over Leyte Gulf, vividly illustrated the tactic's devastating lethality when Zero pilots attempted to directly counter it. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McGuire, piloting a P-38, found himself embroiled in a fierce engagement with 4 Zeros at an altitude of 18,000 feet. When the lead Zeros successfully achieved a firing position, McGuire expertly rolled his aircraft inverted and initiated a steep dive. The Japanese pilot, determined to maintain Maguire within his gun sight, followed suit. Two critical events transpired simultaneously. Maguire's P-38 rapidly accelerated beyond 450 miles per hour in the dive, maintaining its structural integrity without compromise, while the pursuing Zero began to experience severe and alarming vibrations as its speed approached 380 miles per hour. The Japanese pilot was compelled to abort his pursuit prematurely, or face the imminent risk of catastrophic airframe failure. Maguire subsequently leveled out at 6,000 feet, then swiftly climbed back into the fray, now possessing superior energy, and managed to shoot down two of the four Zeros. The remaining two Japanese aircraft promptly disengaged from the engagement. The core difficulty confronting Japanese pilots stemmed from the fact that their most effective combat aircraft, the revered Zero, had become optimized for an outdated style of combat by late 1944. Earlier in the conflict, when aerial engagements predominantly occurred at medium altitudes and involved protracted turning fights, the Zero's inherent characteristics were indeed ideally suited for such scenarios. However, as American tactical doctrines evolved decisively towards high-speed slashing attacks and dynamic vertical maneuvers, the Zero's once pronounced advantages became largely irrelevant. Concurrently, its inherent disadvantages, namely, its conspicuous lack of armor, its lightweight structural design, and its comparatively lower dive speed, metamorphosed into critical and exploitable vulnerabilities. Japanese aircraft designers, to their credit, recognized this burgeoning problem. Later Model Zero variants and newer designs, such as the formidable J-2M Raiden, featured improved dive performance and significantly stronger airframes. Nevertheless, these advanced aircraft arrived in insufficient numbers, and far too late to fundamentally alter the tactical balance of power. Japanese training programs also proved incapable of adapting with the requisite speed. By 1944, Japan was experiencing an alarming attrition rate of experienced pilots, losing them far more rapidly than they could be adequately replaced. New pilots received severely abbreviated training regimens that primarily emphasized basic flight skills and traditional, outmoded dogfighting tactics. There simply wasn't sufficient time or fuel resources available to impart advanced energy management principles or sophisticated vertical combat techniques. Conversely, American training programs had assiduously incorporated invaluable lessons gleaned directly from the experiences of combat veterans. Replacement pilots arriving in the Pacific Theater in late 1944 were already conversant with inverted dive tactics even before they embarked upon their inaugural combat mission. The critical knowledge gap had, by this point, dramatically reversed. Japanese pilots, once regarded as the most experienced and skilled aviators in the theater, were now frequently the least prepared for the harsh realities of the war's contemporary tactical environment. The inverted dive tactics, meticulously developed over the Pacific between 1943 and 1945, did not fade into obscurity with the cessation of World War II. Instead, they became deeply embedded within the foundational doctrine of fighter tactics, albeit often without explicit attribution to the desperate and ingenious innovations of P-38 and Corsair pilots, who were quite literally fighting for their very survival. Modern fighter combat training at prestigious institutions, like the Navy Fighter Weapons School, universally known as Top Gun, routinely incorporates negative G maneuvers as standard defensive tactics. While the contemporary terminology has evolved, present-day pilots might refer to it as a negative G pushover or an unloaded roll. The fundamental physics and underlying purpose remain precisely identical to what Thomas Lynch intuitively grasped over New Guinea in April 1943. The Korean War subsequently witnessed American pilots employing strikingly similar tactics against the formidable MiG-15s. The Soviet-built jet fighter boasted excellent high-altitude performance and possessed the ability to outturn most American aircraft in horizontal combat engagements. F-86 Sabre pilots, confronting predicaments analogous to those encountered by P-38 pilots against Zeros, judiciously employed vertical maneuvers and negative G escapes when MiGs achieved advantageous firing positions. Captain Joseph McConnell, the top American ace of the Korean War, with an impressive 16 aerial victories, explicitly credited his survival in several critical engagements to what he termed rolling out underneath pursuing MiGs, a phrase that precisely encapsulated the inverted dive concept, now skillfully adapted to jet combat at an astounding 40,000 feet and speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. Vietnam-era fighter pilots, unfortunately, relearned these crucial lessons through arduous experience. Early in that protracted conflict, American pilots, whose training had predominantly geared them towards beyond visual range missile combat, unexpectedly found themselves embroiled in close-range dogfights against the nimble MiG-17s and MiG-21s. The initial engagement results proved notably disadvantageous. The foundational establishment of Top Gun in 1969 at Naval Air Station Miramar represented a formal institutional acknowledgement that fundamental dogfighting skills, including negative G defensive maneuvers, retained their critical importance despite notable technological leaps. Instructors at Top Gun imparted strategies that Pacific War veterans would have instantly recognized: exploit your aircraft's inherent capabilities, circumvent the adversary's strengths, and when on the defensive, adopt an upright or inverted vertical posture if circumstances necessitated. Modern fighter aircraft are now inherently engineered with negative G capability built directly into their design. Aircraft such as the F-16, F/A-18, and F-35 all feature advanced fuel systems, sophisticated engine designs, and robust airframes that permit prolonged inverted operation without the debilitating limitations that afflicted World War II-era aircraft. Pilots undergo rigorous training in centrifuges to build physiological tolerance for both positive and negative G-forces. The once dreaded redout effect that terrified pilots in 1943 is now a comprehensively understood and controllable phenomenon. Yet, the enduring fundamental concept remains unaltered. Negative G flight enables the execution of maneuvers that opponents do not anticipate, thereby creating vital tactical disengagement and opening avenues for offensive action. What truly renders this Pacific War innovation extraordinary is its genesis entirely outside prescribed official channels. No aeronautical engineer meticulously designed this tactic. No tactical development board formally approved its implementation. No training command incorporated it into their standard curricula until after pilots had already unequivocally proven its irrefutable efficacy through hundreds of innumerable aerial encounters. It spread organically through the informal warrior network, with seasoned aviators diligently teaching critical survival skills to newly deployed personnel, disseminating knowledge person to person, and from squadron to squadron. The brave men who developed these ingenious tactics received scant recognition beyond their immediate units. Most of them never knew that their improvised methodologies would profoundly influence fighter combat doctrine for the ensuing 80 years. Richard Bong, America's renowned top ace with an astounding 40 victories, partly survived the war due to his proficient application of vertical combat and his unwavering resolve to fly inverted when exigencies demanded. Thomas Lynch, the pioneering aviator who first intentionally employed the tactic, tragically perished in the line of duty over the Philippines in March 1944, not because his tactics failed, but because combat flying was, statistically, an inherently lethal endeavor, irrespective of individual skill. Their enduring legacy transcends ceremonial accolades or official recognition. It resides in the undeniable fact that fighter pilots today still train to roll inverted and push negative G when on the defensive, an uninterrupted ancestral link to the critical improvisations made in cockpits over the Pacific, where survival often required rewriting the rules mid-flight.